Hello, this is the Elixir of Awareness channel, and you're watching episode 13. In this episode, we want to talk about the fear of emotions. We want to talk about the wall that we put between ourselves and our feelings, and also the painful things that are happening behind that wall. And also in this episode, you will hear the story of a friend. It's very strange that, for example, in the process of treating one of our 32 teeth, we expect to suffer pain. That means we consider it reasonable to tolerate a certain amount of pain so that our tooth will heal again. But in the treatment of one of the most complex parts of our existence, which is our psyche, we don't expect this pain and we try to heal without suffering any pain. We're looking for a shortcut. We like to have only a happy set of good feelings flowing through our minds. Who doesn't have this wish? But the world doesn't write its notes based on our wishes. This movie that we're living is based on a true story and is made in the heart of reality. And so sometimes the stories have pages that are full of anger, and sometimes they've words that are full of fear. And of course, many times they're also full of enthusiasm and joy. But if we only focus on the happy seasons, we'll miss an important part of the story. Look at yourself and the story you've lived so far. Think about the good or bad experiences you've had so far. Think about how those experiences made you the person you're today. So we can't ignore some chapters. We can't be afraid of our feelings because some of them are unpleasant. And in this episode, we try to say how don't be afraid of yourself and your feelings. The root of many of our physical and mental sufferings is that we're afraid of our feelings for some reason, and as a result, we turn them into many other painful things. For example, we turn them into anxiety or shame. Or, for example, sometimes we're angry, and because we've no right to be angry because of the circumstances, we suppress this feeling and turn it into a vague and permanent anxiety that gradually destroys us painfully. Sometimes we're extremely sad, but because being strong has always been a value that has always been instilled in us by the environment and people, we wear a mask of happiness. We let depression kill us from the inside. And if we listen carefully, behind our silent and fake smile, we can hear the sound of our own breaking. Not feeling normal sadness turns it into anxiety, which maybe this feeling of anxiety is less than sadness at the moment, but usually it lasts much longer than the feeling of sadness. That's why many of us are more worn out than depressed these days.
I had a friend who was very precious and dear to me. We rarely saw each other, but we understood each other well. We met each other after many years. We kissed, and a few words were exchanged between us, and we kept silent. One day we had lunch together and said goodbye. He went somewhere far away. A beautiful, peaceful, and green place. He didn't need to go because he'd become a doctor, and he'd good income and a good social status. He went and time passed. After a year, they informed me that my friend committed suicide. My calm, noble, kind, and understanding friend, who'd privileged social and scientific positions, committed suicide. Now years have passed since his death, but my sadness is the same as the first day of his death. I couldn't understand what was going on inside him. Even the closest people have many unsaid words. Maybe words are meant to cover up. We say something to hide something. Maybe the real world is the unspoken's world. The world of the unsaid and the unknown and the unheard. A world that exists more than the existing world.
Emotions are caused by external stimuli. A stimulus or event in the external world activates one of our internal emotions. At this moment, a reaction such as sadness, happiness, anger, guilt, love, or other emotions is activated in our minds. But sometimes these feelings are very complicated or forbidden or painful. Here our brain does a strange thing. It actually activates a defense mechanism so that we don't experience the suffering of that complex, forbidden, or painful feeling. This local anesthesia isn't without cost for us in the long run. Emotions that are suppressed in this way turn into permanent shame or anxiety in the long run. Every natural feeling we've has a function for our survival. And when we suppress that feeling in ourselves, we suffer from all kinds of mental and emotional complications. When we suppress and hide even a good feeling like happiness and try not to laugh for a while, we put a strange pressure on our mind and brain and even the capillaries of our body. Now think about what kind of tension we intensify in our psyche when we suppress a great suffering or a painful feeling for years. What most of us are unaware of is that many of our natural emotions are buried under layers of defense mechanisms and ultimately anxiety. And they affected us in the form of various mental and psychological complications. We're afraid of emotions both on a personal and social level. Research shows that this fear that we want to talk about disables us in 4 stages. The first stage is that we see a stimulus in the surrounding world and something happens in the outside world that causes an emotion to be activated in our brain. The second step is that if our brain recognizes that feeling as dangerous or painful, it replaces that feeling with anxiety with the help of a series of defense mechanisms. This process happens in just a few milliseconds. Here, the third step happens. The third stage is that instead of natural emotions such as happiness, sadness, anger, love, and other human emotions, the person is filled with anxiety and shame. In the fourth stage, with the passage of time, these defense mechanisms in our psyche lead to chronic complications such as depression. And in our bodies, they turn into all kinds of disorders and pains. But the question is, why do these 4 stages start at all? There are many reasons why we're afraid of some of our feelings. One is the conditions in which we grew up and were educated. The society or family you live in may not be a normal society or family for years. It means the educational system and the economic conditions of your society and the cultural conditions of the family in which you were born. And this diagnosis is by yours. But in any case, it's possible that you grew up in these conditions, and this issue has had a series of destructive effects on your mind and body. For example, as we mentioned before, creating shame is a common educational tool in some underdeveloped societies. Sometimes we embarrass children to correct them. And this is a very wrong way. The feeling of shame and fear is the feeling that has made us more isolated than ever. Some of us wound ourselves with the knife of shame and fear every day. This is just an example of something that most of us may have experienced. Just one example of what's made us afraid to accept ourselves as normal human beings.
It wasn't my father's fault that he was frowning at my mother's skin Cherokees. This hateful pride was a part of the existence and blood structure of my people at that time. Whenever I was watching my grandfather, I wanted to cut off all the capillaries of arrogance from his arteries. But alas, that this sinister legacy that was the cause of the formation of the sons of the men of my people should have flowed from the red cheeks of an apple. And that apple is my mother's face.
Plato compares human life to a chariot pulled by 2 horses. One of the horses that is a symbol of logic is authentic, beautiful, and good. And the other horse, which is a symbol of feeling, is inauthentic, ill-behaved, and ugly. This false metaphor has become a collective belief for more than 2,000 years. The belief that logic is good and emotions are bad. Because Plato lived in a time when there was almost no science about brain function. But we now know that a brain that can't feel can't think. And we know that a brain that suppresses emotions replaces pain. Unfortunately, we learned in life that a good child is never afraid. And also, they don't get angry, they don't get tired, and even they don't get emotional. We've believed that we've no right to be vulnerable. And by the way, this has made us more vulnerable.
Habib was an old friend from childhood in Tabriz city located in Iran. He wasn't a weak student, he was family-friendly and very polite. When his father died, his family tried to give him the role of father. But people have to play their own role. Those who play the role of others will become victims whether we like it or not. His family didn't know this. As many families don't know, they raised Habib early, very soon. We didn't see him for several months, and when we saw him, he'd changed completely. Walking type, dressing style, face color, and other details such as the type of walking, the style of clothing, the color of the face, and other details. I loved him very much, because we were very close to each other. But when I saw all those changes, I no longer had those previous feelings about him. He'd gone through many very hard experiences in a short period. He was killed a few months later. I don't know, maybe because he grew up before he grew up.
To understand more details of this topic, let's talk about a series of common defense mechanisms of the brain. We want to understand those complicated, painful, or forbidden feelings with what mechanisms are suppressed. One of the most common defense mechanisms is suppression and denial. Freud describes repression as follows. Suppression means to push something away from ourselves and keep it away from consciousness. And he goes on to say that repression isn't something that happens once. Rather, it's a lot of fear that takes a lot of energy from us so that what's been suppressed doesn't reach our consciousness. Now you may ask yourself why our mind should bring something that has been repressed and resolve back to the level of consciousness. The reason is simple, because it hasn't been resolved still. For example, if you don't realize at your conscious level how angry you're at the hands of one of your loved ones, it doesn't mean that you aren't angry. Rather, as we explained, anger screams its presence painfully in secret forms. To make this defense mechanism of suppression and denial a little more tangible for you, let's give some examples. For example, someone may have been hurt by toxic relationships in their life. As a result, the person suppresses and denies the basis of having an intimate relationship. It means that person tries to be alone and live away from human affection. In fact, the person suppresses the need for human relationships, but this causes painful and long-term mental and psychological complications, such as depression. The second defense mechanism is displacement. Sometimes you experience a certain feeling. For example, you're angry with your boss, but you can't show this feeling because of the fear of losing your job. That's why you direct this feeling of anger toward another person, to someone who'd no role in your anger. Unlike the previous defense mechanism, we don't suppress or deny our feelings here, but we feel the feeling of anger completely, and only the reason for its formation is shifted in our mind. If we want to examine this defense mechanism at the social level, we can point to different examples. For instance, a society that is angry with its rulers but can't express this dissatisfaction directs this feeling of anger toward its innocent citizens. In this society, even in the simplest relationships, people get involved with each other for the smallest reasons. It means a society where people are on the verge of exploding, and they transfer the anger that they can't express elsewhere to each other. In this way, we can recognize the root of many difficulties in society and think about it, and maybe cure it. The displacement mechanism has various examples. One of the examples of the displacement mechanism that is less understood is the relationship between becoming a parent and feeling forbidden anger. Perhaps raising a child is the hardest and biggest project that a human does in their life. The experience of having a child can be described as if a part of you is living outside of you. Along with the good feelings that the parents experience, worry and confusion to take care of a child may make the parent confused and tired, and this is completely normal. But society secretly forbids even the experience of this feeling for parents. Which father or mother is so heartless and irresponsible that they gets upset and angry about having a child? And this is what parents should suppress inside themselves. Because social conditions don't even allow talking about this complex, painful, and forbidden feeling. We just want to say that sometimes anger and frustration are a natural part of a parent's life experience, but we deny it. This feeling of anger is caused by a lot of deprivation that people experience after becoming a father or mother. For example, due to cultural and social conditions, a mother doesn't have the right to say that sometimes she's tired and needs a short leave. But this forbidden feeling doesn't disappear inside her, but just the source of that feeling changes with the displacement mechanism. For example, this feeling may turn into anger towards your husband, because we can't be angry with our baby, but we can be angry with our wife. For example, a mother who hasn't slept well for a long time because of taking care of her baby and has severe insomnia may direct this feeling of anger toward her husband, instead of being angry at her defenseless baby. That is to say, she moves the source of her dissatisfaction. Because when she moves that feeling to her husband with that defense mechanism, not only does it not solve the problem, but it also causes new problems in her married life. The third common defense mechanism is the reverse reaction mechanism. Reverse reaction means turning an unacceptable feeling into an opposite feeling. For example, a person has a feeling of anger, but with a defensive mechanism, they show another emotion that is 100% opposite to the feeling of anger. For example, they're very strange and have extremely good behavior with people. Or, for example, a person may be depressed, but they turn this depression into an extreme sense of humor with this defense mechanism. Just like the character of the Joker, who turns sadness into humorous and aggressive behavior and nervous laughter. A person may turn the feeling of shame into narcissism. That is to say, because the person experiences a feeling of extreme shame and feels that someone doesn't love them, they decide to love themselves extremely. And the person shows the behaviors of a narcissist. A person may have lived in a family in which there was a lot of fighting between parents. This person may turn this suffering into something completely opposite. It means that they may become a highly compatible person in their marriage. In fact, that person unconsciously decides not to behave like their parents in any way. And as a result, they become a person who can't bear any tension in the relationship, and as a result, they show an extreme adaptation. There's an important point here. These kinds of people who constantly suppress themselves so that there's no tension in their relationships may forget from one time to the next what their real self is like. And they may forget what they like or even don't like, or what rights they've and what expectations they can have. It means that suffering completely turns into its opposite. And that person only can be saved when they meet their childhood suffering. In fact, they should meet their character as a child who's suffering and sees their parents' arguments, and hug them, and in this way, the suffering will disappear gradually. In this way, a person can distance themselves from that extreme adaptation. Carl Gustav Jung brilliantly writes like this: "There's no coming to consciousness without pain. And when we become aware of our sufferings and the defense mechanisms of the brain, then we can save our identity from the grip of those sufferings." Another example of a reverse reaction mechanism is children who grow up in very restrictive families with extreme prejudices. Children who are judged by perfectionistic and inhuman standards. These children may violate any logical and moral framework in adulthood. That is to say, they act exactly against their suffering. And of course, sometimes this phenomenon shows itself at the level of a generation. Rumi, the great Persian poet, explains beautifully that if a society denies its evils, how all good things are also denied. He says,
"Everything in this world is defined and revealed by its opposite. And because the main truth God has no opposite, it has remained hidden."
The name of the fourth defense mechanism is dissociation and idealization. It has a little subtlety to explain it, so please listen a little more carefully. This mechanism is activated against the painful feeling of ambiguity. The feelings of ambiguity and confusion are so difficult and unbearable for many of us that we prefer to take refuge in a certain feeling. The great psychologist Skinner did a very interesting experiment with pigeons. In this experiment, he kept the pigeons hungry in a cage for a while and fed them at specific times. It means that food suddenly enters the cage while they were hungry. And Skinner and his colleagues observed very strange behavior among pigeons. They found that when pigeons were doing a certain task, they thought that doing that task was related to the arrival of food time. Therefore, when the pigeons got hungry, they'd repeat their special movements so that the food would arrive again. This was a very interesting example of the defense mechanism of simplification or dissociation. It means that sometimes we don't know the reason for a phenomenon, and this lack of knowledge bothers us a lot. That's why we find or create a reason for that matter, and we stubbornly and with all certainty rely on that reason, just like those pigeons. And this defense mechanism captures our consciousness like this. You must have seen people who are sure that they know the truth with absolute certainty. And they're sure that they're right about different things. They're somehow involved in this defense mechanism. Because they're afraid of doubt and uncertainty, they divide all the facts of the world into two parts. In fact, they make them bipolar. It means that only two options, and after that, they idealize these two parts. In this defense mechanism, we first simplify a problem. A complex problem that we're confused about becomes a simple problem with only two options. One option is completely correct, and one option is completely wrong. Then, in an extremely fanatical way, we choose an option that we think is right, and with this, all other people who don't think like us become absolute bad people. And as a result, we mistakenly think that we've reached complete certainty about a complex issue. It seems that this mechanism is one of the most common defense mechanisms that we suffer from at the social level apart from the individual level. One of the reasons why this defense mechanism is seen in a society is the cultural roots of that society. If you pay attention, most of the stories we hear and see are stories whose characters are simply divided into two categories: absolute good and absolute bad. Whether in stories, in the history of literature, or cinema as an industry that is full of stories, and these stories are also influential in our lives, we were heavily involved in polarization, simplification, and idealism. We've been involved in this simple polarization for decades. Always one side of the story. The characters have all the good qualities together. Features such as brave, idealistic, honest, and powerful. And the characters on the other side of the story all have all kinds of bad traits. In fact, they taught us to first ask who's the bad guy and who's the good guy in every story we see or hear. That is to say, this simplification trick has become a stencil that we put on all stories. Because most stories that are around us have shaped us like this. We've low emotional capacity. We can rarely keep two opposite ideas in our minds at the same time. And the world is so complicated that many times the facts have a contradictory form. And only those people can think better and make decisions that can recognize these contradictions and complexities. For example, we can rarely agree with a part of a person and criticize a part of that person. We don't know this. Either people are 0 or 100 for us. In fact, we either completely accept them or completely destroy them. And this is how we destroy every time a person that we made a big idol out of. Usually, we can't criticize a person or a phenomenon. We know how to completely deny a person or a phenomenon. Even our heroes don't have the right to make mistakes like ordinary people sometimes, because in this case, the bipolarity of our mind gets destroyed. We usually think that if a person isn't absolutely good, then they must be absolutely bad. So we also sat on the sofa, and we're always on the right side of history. And this is like a collective gesture of all of us about people and phenomena. And of course the same about love and emotional relationships. Because even our lovers don't have the right to look like ordinary people. For a while we make an extraterrestrial and unique person from them. And then suddenly they become a normal person. And because that ordinary person is far from the perfect image created by our mind, as a result, it seems very small. Then we become a serial lover. Just exactly like a serial killer who constantly goes to different victims, we also constantly idealize a person. And because that image conflicts with reality, after a while that person becomes an absolute bad person. And as a result, we decide to look for new and more newest victims. And we also experience emotional fluctuation. It means after an overwhelming feeling of passion at the beginning of a relationship, we experience a feeling of sadness, depression, and deep disappointment after our ideal mental image is destroyed. Apart from others, sometimes we do this even with ourselves. Sometimes we're at the peak of loving ourselves. And sometimes we just make one mistake so big that we can no longer continue living. This simple mind sometimes creates the best feelings in us, and we imagine ourselves as superhuman. And sometimes it creates the biggest and most violent insults in us. And we aren't in a realistic reality with ourselves. The bitter point of the story is that we constantly have such fluctuating feelings, not only about ourselves but collectively, and about the society in which we live. That is to say, at the national level, we're constantly involved in two conflicting feelings. Sometimes we believe that we're the smartest and best people in the world. And sometimes we believe that we're the most backward and worst people in the world. We don't know how to love and accept our real national image, and of course criticize it to make it better. In fact, we're stuck in a cycle of shame and narcissism. And this can reduce the ability of a nation and a society to improve. Whether from an individual or social point of view, getting to know the various defense mechanisms of the brain can solve many of our problems. Let's quickly review just the headlines of these few defense mechanisms we talked about. We talked about the mechanism of suppression and denial. We explained the displacement mechanism, in which we were displacing the reason for that feeling. We also talked about the mechanism of the reverse reaction, when we were experiencing an opposite feeling of that pain. And at the end, we talked about dissociation and idealization mechanism. Now let's think a little about ourselves and search a little in ourselves. Which defense mechanism are we constantly using? What complex, forbidden, or painful emotion is there in us that hurts us that we suppress or change it by using these defense mechanisms? Do we've the courage to at least experience that feeling in some important situations in our lives and distance ourselves from these defense mechanisms? One of the main reasons why we're afraid of our feelings is that we've misunderstood the idea of happiness. We were looking for permanent happiness, and we numbed ourselves to the rest of our feelings, and this is the reason why we moved away from the essence of life, and also from our essence. And this issue has caused real happiness to become a rare commodity in our lives.
People here are so happy that they don't fall in love anymore. They've no feelings. They don't need anyone else, even to God. They sit in front of their illuminated houses in the morning and wait for death until night.
An unconscious smile that comes from a deep feeling of joy, or a cry that comes from a sad heart, or even a person who's been oppressed and is experiencing grief, shouldn't be suppressed. If we suppress our emotions, we'll harm our souls. We can stop a natural feeling just as much as we can stop ourselves from sneezing. If we do this for a long time, we'll experience all kinds of mental and physical sufferings. That's why most people gradually become weak and become the walking deads. We must give ourselves the right to be weak and have the courage to experience natural feelings. Feelings that may be very short-lived and pass us by and don't stay with us for a long time. But by keeping and suppressing them inside, our psyche is gradually damaged, and suddenly we realize the consequences in the form of mental and physical complications. Let's take some time for ourselves and experience a few moments of solitude and face ourselves. And try to find a series of hidden emotions that are usually painful in us and face them. The football legend Pelé, rest in peace, talks about a story about the 1950 final World Cup. On the 16th of July, Pelé was 9 years old, that experienced one of the most important events in the history of Brazil with his people. In that period of the World Cup, the Brazilian national team passed all its opponents in different stages with authority and reached the finals, and it became the opponent of Uruguay, which in those days wasn't a coherent and strong team compared with Brazil. All the people of Brazil were sure that they'd win the World Cup. In the second half of the game, Brazil scored a goal and everyone was waiting for the next goals. Suddenly, in the 66th minute, something happens that plunges the entire Brazilian people into great shock and sadness. Uruguay scores a goal, and the game reporter shouts, "Goal, goal for Uruguay." And later in an interview, he said that I said twice, because I was sure that the people of Brazil wouldn't believe the first. In the 79th minute, Brazil receives the second goal, and suddenly it seems as if the entire Brazilian population freezes in one moment, because all their hopes suddenly turn into despair. It's a great collective sadness that makes millions of hearts alike in one moment. In describing such a moment, Pelé says like this: "The day we lost, a big sadness filled all of Brazil. Even till the remotest villages, we suddenly became a geographical area where all the residents had only one sadness. The name of our sorrow was Brazil, and this is how we understood for the first time what Brazil is. The shoulders of my father and other Boro men shook from crying as much as the shoulders of a man with a car in Sao Paulo." On July 16, 1950, in the evening when Uruguay lifted the cup, we became Brazil. We were no longer strangers to each other, and I don't think we were strangers again after that also. Do you see how a great common sadness can unite the hearts of millions of people and be the beginning of the birth of a nation? A society that doesn't feel its great sadness can't turn this great sadness into great work. Now, the final question of this episode is, do you think you fear to express your real feelings? What's your experience with this? Please share your comments with us, and thank you for staying with us until the end of this episode.